The envelope was sitting on the gas tank when Roy Decker walked out to the garage at 4:47 in the morning. Not inside the garage. On top of the bike. On the tank of his 1974 Harley-Davidson FLH Electra Glide, the one he called Eleanor, the one he hadn't started in 14 months. Someone had come into his garage in the night, in the dark, in Flagstaff, Arizona, and left a white envelope balanced on the chrome of the gas cap. No name on the front. No postage. Just a single word written in black marker that made Roy Decker's jaw go tight the way it used to go tight in the Mekong Delta. The word was, brother. He didn't open it right away. He stood in the yellow light of the single bulb hanging from the rafter, wearing his boots and his boxers and nothing else in the October cold, and he looked at the envelope the way a man looks at something he already knows is going to break him open again. Because that word, brother, belonged to another life. A life that had ended 14 months ago on a stretch of I-40 outside Winslow, and Roy had sealed that life into a box and slid the box into the dark the same way men from the 101st Airborne learned to do with the things they couldn't carry anymore. He set his hand on Eleanor's tank. The metal was cold. The envelope crinkled under his palm. He did not open it. He made coffee instead. He stood at the kitchen window while the pot dripped and watched the pine trees on the ridge go from black to gray in the first thin light, and he thought about 14 months, and about 2,156 miles, and about a man named Calhoun Webb who had been dead for exactly that long. Some stories begin with thunder. This one begins with a white envelope on a cold tank at 5 in the morning. But what comes after that envelope, what one man does when everything in him says to sit still and let the past be the past, that is the story this road wants to tell. And the road always tells it whether you're ready or not. Roy Decker was 53 years old in the autumn of 2001. He had a gray beard that he trimmed maybe 4 times a year, a right knee that predicted rain better than the Weather Channel, and a tattoo on his left forearm, a shield, a wheel, and the words Iron Promise, that he'd covered with a long-sleeve shirt every day for 14 months. He'd done 2 tours in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division, come home to Phoenix in 1971 with a Purple Heart and a distrust of silence that took years to name, and found his people, the only people who made the silence bearable, in a motorcycle club called the Iron Promise Brotherhood out of Kingman, Arizona. They were not an outlaw club. That matters. They were Vietnam veterans, most of them, or the sons and younger brothers of Vietnam veterans, and what bound them was the particular American ache of men who had been asked to do enormous things and then handed back their civilian clothes and told to be fine. They rode together. They looked out for each other's families. When Garrett Hill's daughter needed surgery in 2000 and Garrett's insurance turned around and said no, it was the Iron Promise Brotherhood that held a rally in Laughlin and raised $11,000 in a weekend. When old Skip Marchetti lost his wife to cancer in the spring of 1999, it was Roy and Calhoun and the rest who rode to Barstow and spent 3 days with Skip in his house, not saying much, just being there, just being warm bodies against the grief. That was what the club was. A wall against the cold. And then Calhoun Webb died on a Tuesday morning in August of 2000, and the wall came down. Roy poured his coffee. He added 2 spoonfuls of sugar, the way Calhoun used to tease him about, "You're a grown man, Roy, not a child at a birthday party." He stood at the window and let the steam rise against his face, and finally he said out loud, to no one, to the pine trees going gray in the distance, "All right." He went back to the garage. The envelope was still there. He picked it up, and he felt the weight of something stiff inside, a card, maybe, or a photograph. He ran his thumb under the flap. Inside was a single photograph. 4 inches by 6. It showed 8 men standing in front of a row of motorcycles on a blacktop road somewhere in the Mojave Desert, the sky above them the color of a gas flame, which meant it was either very early morning or very late evening. Roy recognized every face. On the far left, Garrett Hill, with his big reddish mustache. Next to him, young Denny Castillo, who couldn't have been more than 25 when that photo was taken, squinting into the camera and grinning. Then Roy himself. Then, in the middle of the frame, standing a full inch taller than everyone else, one hand resting on the mirror of his 1971 Harley-Davidson Super Glide, wearing the Iron Promise cut and a smile that seemed to cost him nothing, Calhoun Webb. On the back of the photograph, in the same black marker as the envelope, he always said you were the one who would hold it together. 2,156 miles. You'll know where it starts. Roy turned the photograph over and looked at Calhoun's face for a long time. He hadn't looked at Calhoun's face in 14 months. He set the photograph on Eleanor's tank and walked back inside and drank his coffee standing up, and the feeling in his chest was like a key being inserted into a lock that no one had touched in a very long time. You'll know where it starts. He knew. Interstate 40, east of Flagstaff. The exact pull-off where it had happened. Mile marker 211. The last place Roy had seen Calhoun Webb alive. What Roy Decker understood, standing in his kitchen at 5 in the morning with a photograph and a black marker message and 14 months of closed doors behind him, was that someone was asking him to go back. Back to mile marker 211. Back to Winslow. Back to the thing that had broken the Iron Promise Brotherhood into 8 separate islands of silence. What he didn't understand yet was what he'd find when he got there. Or who else would be waiting along the 2,156 miles that followed. The road, though, already knew. To understand what broke the Brotherhood, you need to go back to that Tuesday in August. Not all the way back, just to the morning, to the sound of it, to what Roy carried out of it. They had been riding from Kingman to Albuquerque for the club's annual rally, all 8 of them strung out across the right lane of I-40 like a sentence being written across the desert. Roy on Eleanor. Calhoun on his Super Glide. Garrett, Denny, Skip Marchetti, brothers Luis and Carlos Vega from Needles, and a man named Pete Fogarty who ran the shop in Kingman where most of their bikes had been born and rebuilt. 8 men. 8 machines. A Tuesday morning in August with the heat already coming off the pavement in visible waves and the sky so blue it looked painted on. Outside Winslow, Calhoun's Super Glide developed a shimmy in the front end that everyone could hear, that particular dry rattle that means a wheel bearing is giving up the ghost. Calhoun pulled off at a gravel lay-by at mile marker 211 and they all pulled off with him, the way you do, the way you always do. Nobody considered not pulling off. That's the code. Pete Fogarty got down on his knees in the gravel and put his face close to the front wheel and said they'd need a new bearing, and it wasn't something he could fix roadside with what they were carrying. Nearest shop would be Winslow, 7 miles east. They could wait for a truck, or Calhoun could ride it slow and careful and they'd all go with him. Calhoun said he'd ride it. Of course he said that. He was 61 years old and had been riding since before half of them were born and he did not leave his bike on the side of the road. What happened next took 11 seconds. A flatbed truck, overloaded, its driver later admitted to having been awake for 22 hours, drifted onto the shoulder at exactly the moment Calhoun was easing the Super Glide back onto the pavement. The truck's right front corner caught Calhoun at the hip. The Super Glide went down. Calhoun went down. The truck didn't stop for 200 yards. Roy was behind Calhoun by 30 feet. He saw all of it. The official investigation took 6 weeks and found the truck driver negligent but not criminally liable, which was a sentence that Roy Decker still could not hold in his mouth without his hands going cold. The Brotherhood tried to contest it, tried to push for more, and what happened during those 6 weeks was the thing that broke them. Accusations were made, quietly, sideways, the way accusations always travel in grief. Someone said Roy should have been riding closer and could have done something. Someone said Pete Fogarty should have insisted on a tow instead of letting Calhoun ride. The accusations were irrational, born entirely from the kind of desperate need to assign fault that comes when grief has nowhere else to go. But they landed. And they stuck. By October of 2000, Roy Decker had not spoken to Pete Fogarty in 6 weeks. By December, Garrett Hill had stopped returning calls. By March of 2001, the Iron Promise Brotherhood, for all practical purposes, had ceased to exist. 8 men. 8 islands. 1 dead brother between them. Roy sat with all of that at his kitchen table on that October morning in 2001 while the coffee went cold. He turned the photograph over and over in his hands, running his thumb across Calhoun's smile in the center of the frame. He thought about the words, "He always said you were the one who would hold it together." The only person who would have written that was someone who had talked to Calhoun. Someone who had known him well enough to remember him saying it. The handwriting wasn't any of the others, not Garrett's, not Denny's. Roy thought he recognized the careful, unhurried letters from somewhere close to his memory, but he couldn't quite place them, and the uncertainty of it was another hook in him, pulling him forward. He went back to the garage. He stood in front of Eleanor for a long moment. Eleanor was a 1974 Harley-Davidson FLH Electra Glide in midnight blue, meaning she was painted the color of the sky just after the sun drops below the horizon but before the stars appear. Roy had bought her second-hand in 1979 from a man in Tucson who'd ridden her across the Southwest for 2 years and then gotten married and decided the bike was an argument waiting to happen. Roy had rebuilt her engine in 1985, rebuilt it again in 1994, and in the spring of 2000 had given her new chrome and new tires and a fuel system that ran quieter than anything he'd touched at that voltage. She was not a museum piece. She was a machine built to move. He had covered her with a canvas tarp 14 months ago and had not touched the tarp since. He pulled the tarp off. The chrome caught the single bulb and threw light back at him. He ran his hand along the tank, feeling the ridges of the chrome cap, the slight warmth the metal held even in the cold, the way the paint was still smooth and perfect under his palm because he had always taken care of her the way you take care of the things that have carried you through the worst. He rolled Eleanor out of the garage and into the pale blue of the early morning, and he looked at her on the gravel of the driveway under the open sky, and she looked the way she always looked, like a promise he hadn't kept yet. He went inside. He pulled on jeans, his Red Wing boots, a flannel shirt, and over all of it the Iron Promise cut, the leather vest with the club patch on the back, the patch he had not put on his body in 14 months. It was heavier than he remembered. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment, looking at the man in the cut, the man with the gray beard and the tired eyes, and then he went back outside. Eleanor started on the third kick. The engine caught with a low, serious rumble that Roy felt in the backs of his knees, that particular frequency of a big V-twin engine at idle that had always sounded to him like the earth clearing its throat. He let her warm up for 5 minutes, sitting still in the driveway with the pines above him, listening to the engine find its rhythm. Then he rode east on I-40. Toward Winslow. Toward mile marker 211. Toward the place where 2,156 miles began. The sun was fully up by the time he reached the pull-off at mile marker 211, burning the cold out of the air and laying long shadows across the gravel. Roy rolled Eleanor off the pavement and stopped the engine and put the kickstand down and sat for a moment with his hands on his thighs. The pull-off was just gravel. Scrubby desert brush, a few rocks, the distant red walls of a mesa to the south. There was no marker. No memorial. Nothing that told the world that Calhoun Webb had been here. The road didn't care about the names of the men who had ridden it. The road just kept being itself, indifferent, enormous, stretching east toward Albuquerque and west toward Flagstaff and in both directions toward everything Roy had been trying not to think about. He got off the bike. He walked to the edge of the gravel and stood looking east down I-40, watching the trucks and cars move in the distance, and he let himself stand in the exact spot where he had stood 14 months ago, in the chaos and the noise and the terrible clarity of the moments just after, and he let the place be the place. He stood there for maybe 10 minutes. And then he looked down and saw the second envelope. It was tucked under a flat stone at the edge of the gravel, as if placed there with intention. This one was heavier than the first. Roy picked it up and opened it. Inside was a key. A motorcycle key, with a worn rubber grip and a number stamped on the metal, 71 SGK. And a note, the same black marker, the same careful hand, Winslow. Archer's Auto on Route 87. Ask for the bike in the back. Roy looked at the key in his palm. He looked at the number. He looked east down the highway. He got back on Eleanor and rode into Winslow. Archer's Auto on Route 87 was the kind of shop that seems to have always been there and always will be, a long cinderblock building with 3 bays, 2 of them open, and out front a hand-painted sign with a red A on it that was faded enough to have been there since before the interstate was built. Roy pulled in and a young man with a broom looked up from the forecourt. Roy showed him the key. The young man nodded without any surprise, as if he'd been expecting it, and led Roy through the shop, past a disassembled truck engine and a wall of fan belts and the particular smell of oil and rubber and metal that Roy associated with peace, and out through the back door into a small yard. And there it was. Calhoun Webb's 1971 Harley-Davidson Super Glide. In pieces, but there, the frame, the tanks, the engine, all of it laid out on a workbench and on sheets of canvas on the ground, clean and labeled, every part accounted for. Not destroyed. Not lost. Rebuilt, or in the process of being rebuilt, by someone who had taken extraordinary care. The front wheel, the one with the failed bearing, had been replaced. The frame was straight. The engine cases were clean enough to see your face in. Roy stood over the laid-out machine for a long time. Someone had gone and found the Super Glide. The police had impounded it after the accident. The family, Calhoun had no family left, his wife had passed in 1995 and they'd had no children, would have been Pete Fogarty, or Roy himself, if either of them had been in a state of mind to act. But they hadn't been. And so the bike had disappeared into the machinery of the state, and Roy had assumed it was gone. But here it was. The young man was still standing nearby. Roy turned to him. "Who brought this here?" The young man glanced toward the back of the yard, toward a door that led to a small office, and he said, "He's been waiting for you." Roy pushed the door open. The office was small, warm, smelling of coffee and machine oil and something like cedar. Behind a metal desk, in a chair that had been pushed back so the man in it could stretch his long legs out in front of him, was Pete Fogarty. Pete was 58 that year, a tall, angular man with a long jaw and hands that were always slightly stained with grease no matter how much he washed them, because some things go deeper than washing. He had a mug of coffee on the desk and he was looking at Roy the way a man looks at another man when he has been rehearsing what to say and has finally decided he doesn't know how to say any of it. Roy pulled up the other chair without a word and sat down. They were quiet for a moment. The sounds of the shop came through the wall. "You got the envelope," Pete said finally. Roy set the key on the desk between them. "I've been working on the Super Glide for 3 months. Pete looked at his hands. "I had a friend at the impound yard in Flagstaff. Cost me more in favors than I want to count. I needed to do something with my hands, Roy. I needed to put it back together." Something shifted in Roy's chest. Not resolution, not yet, something earlier than resolution. The first movement of ice beginning to fracture. "The envelopes," Roy said. "Mine was the photograph. I drove up to Flagstaff last night to put it on the tank." Pete looked up. "The note, he always said you were the one who would hold it together." "That's true, Roy. He told me that at the rally in Laughlin, the last rally we all did together. He said if anything ever happened to me, Roy will be the one to bring everyone back. He said you were the gravity of the group. He called it that." Gravity. Roy looked at the photograph he'd carried in his shirt pocket and set it on the table between them. Calhoun in the center of the frame, hand on the Super Glide's mirror, smiling like it cost him nothing. "I blamed you," Roy said. "For letting him ride with the bad bearing. I know you did. I was wrong." Pete was quiet for a moment. "I blamed myself. For a long time I couldn't separate the two." The room held that for a moment. The shop sounds. The coffee cooling. "The bike can be rebuilt," Roy said finally. Pete nodded. "She will be. I need another 3 weeks, maybe 4. But she'll run." He paused. "I want to ride it to the rally. In Albuquerque. The one we never made." Roy looked at him. "The others?" "That's the 2,156 miles." Pete reached into the desk drawer and put down a folded piece of paper, a hand-drawn map, highway numbers, and town names, 8 stops marked with small circles. I know where each one of them is. I've been tracking. Garrett's up in Durango now. Denny's in Amarillo. The Vega brothers are still in Needles. Skip moved to Santa Fe after his wife passed. Each stop on that map is one of ours. Roy unfolded the map slowly. 8 circles. 8 islands. And at the end of the line, a 9th circle marked simply, Albuquerque. You planned all this, Roy said. Calhoun would have. Pete wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. I'm not him. But I know what he would have done. Roy picked up the map. He folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, next to the photograph. He stood. He looked at Pete for a long moment, this man he had not spoken to in 14 months, this man whose hands had been the last careful hands on Calhoun's machine before everything went sideways, and something in him settled. Not healed. Settled, the way ground settles after a long rain. He said, "How much of her can you get on the road by Thursday?" Pete Fogarty allowed himself a very small smile. All of it. They did not leave Thursday. There was too much to sort, too many pieces of the Super Glide still waiting, and Roy spent those days in Archer's backyard working alongside Pete the way they had worked alongside each other for 20 years, without having to talk much, each knowing what the other needed before the other reached for it. The easy fluency of men who had built things together in the past and still had the memory of it in their hands. Roy called Denny Castillo in Amarillo on Thursday evening from the phone at Archer's. Denny picked up on the second ring and didn't say anything for a long moment after Roy said his name. Then Denny said, "I thought you'd stopped writing." And Roy said, "I thought so too." And Denny said, "I'll be outside when you get here," and that was all that needed to be said. Friday morning, Roy called the Vega brothers in Needles. Luis answered. Roy said, "This is Roy Decker." Luis said, "I know." A silence. Then Luis said, "Carlos is at work. I'll tell him tonight." "When are you coming through?" Roy said, "Monday, probably. We'll come down Route 66 into Needles, spend the night." Luis said, "I'll make tamales." Roy didn't have words for a moment, so he said, "Good," and Luis said, "Yeah," and then they both hung up. Saturday, Pete Fogarty fired up Calhoun's Super Glide for the first time in over a year. The engine caught hard and then smoothed out and then found its voice, and Roy, who was standing 6 feet away at the workbench with his arms crossed, felt the hairs on his forearms stand up. Because the Super Glide sounded exactly the way it had always sounded. Pete had not changed the tune, had not altered the exhaust note, had not put his own interpretation on the machine. He had brought it back to what it was. To who it was. Pete sat on the bike with both hands on the grips and his feet flat on the ground, and his eyes were wet, and he didn't look at Roy and Roy didn't look at him, and that was fine. That was right. Sunday morning, they loaded Eleanor and the Super Glide. Pete would ride Eleanor for now, since the Super Glide belonged on the road back to Albuquerque the way a letter belongs in its envelope, and they pulled out of Winslow on I-40 headed east just before 7 o'clock, the sky clear and cold and blue as a new blade. The Mojave is not kind in October. The sun is lower and harder, throwing shadows at sharp angles across the desert floor, and the wind off the high plateau runs cold enough to cut through denim. Roy rode with his hands inside their gloves and his shoulders rolled forward slightly into the wind, and he felt, for the first time in 14 months, the specific and irreplaceable sensation of the road moving under him at speed, of the painted lines clicking past in a rhythm that worked something loose in the chest the way nothing else in the world could. Pete rode Eleanor just behind and to his left, and between them they carried the sound of 2 engines, and the sound was half of what they'd always been, and they both felt the half that was missing. They stopped for gas in Holbrook. They ate breakfast at a diner on the edge of town where the coffee was strong and the eggs were fried in butter, and the waitress called them both Han without any self-consciousness and refilled their cups without being asked. Roy put the photograph on the table next to his plate, face up. Neither of them said anything about it. It was just there, Calhoun in the center of the frame, 8 men on a desert road, the sky the color of a gas flame. They rode on. The landscape east of Holbrook is the kind of country that makes a man feel accurately small, the painted desert spreading south, the mesas, the long horizontal distances that make the sky look like something that goes on forever. Roy had ridden this road dozens of times over 30 years and it never stopped doing this to him. The country didn't acknowledge your grief or your grudges or your 14 months of silence. It just was itself, enormous and indifferent and somehow, because of that, forgiving. They crossed into New Mexico just before noon. The land changed, the red and orange giving way to a dustier tan, the mesas lower and more scattered, the sky a different shade of blue that Roy had always thought of as the New Mexico blue, a shade cooler and somehow older looking. They came into Gallup for lunch, and Roy pulled into a gas station to check Eleanor's oil, and while he was crouched at the engine Pete walked the perimeter of the forecourt the way riders do, stretching the legs, feeling the ground, recalibrating. Roy was under Eleanor's engine when he heard Pete's boots stop on the concrete and Pete say, quietly, Roy. Roy stood. There was a man leaning against the far side of the fuel pump. Big man, heavy-set, wearing a canvas jacket and work boots. He was looking at them both with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. Roy recognized him after a moment, a beat late, because the man had gained weight and his hair had gone from brown to gray. Garrett Hill. Roy looked at Pete. Pete shrugged minutely. He hadn't arranged this. Garrett walked over. His eyes went to Eleanor, then to the Super Glide, then to Roy's face. He stopped 6 feet away and stuck his hands in his pockets. I was driving through, Garrett said. Coming down from Durango. He paused. Saw the bikes on the way in. Roy looked at him for a long moment. The Garrett Hill he'd known had a reddish mustache and a booming laugh that Roy had always associated with the feeling of being in a room that was warmer than the outside world. This Garrett had the same mustache, grayer now, and the laugh, if it still existed, was somewhere far underneath. You heading south? Roy said. Garrett looked at the map Roy took from his pocket and unfolded on the gas tank. He looked at the 8 circles. He looked at the circle marked Albuquerque. My truck'll be fine in Gallup for a few days, Garrett said. Pete looked at him. Roy looked at him. Garrett cleared his throat. He said, I need to borrow some gear. You got an extra helmet? They found him a helmet in Gallup. They found him a jacket with proper protection and gloves that fit well enough. And at a used shop on Cole Avenue, Gallup used to be full of shops that sold everything, they found a motorcycle. A 1981 Harley-Davidson Sportster 1000, dark red, road-worn but mechanically sound according to Pete's 15-minute assessment. The owner wanted $900. Garrett paid in cash without negotiating. He settled onto the Sportster in the parking lot and fired at once and sat there with his eyes closed for a moment, and Roy watched the set of Garrett's shoulders and saw the man's hands relax on the grips the way hands relax when they've come home to something they'd forgotten they missed. 3 bikes now. 3 men. West to east on I-40 in the October afternoon. They stayed that night in Santa Rosa, New Mexico, at a motor court off Route 66 that had been there since 1955 and still had a sign out front with a neon cowboy whose hat blinked on and off. Roy got a room. Pete got a room. Garrett said he'd sleep in the Sportster's saddle if the air warmed up, and Roy told him he was an idiot, and Garrett said that sounded about right, and Roy almost smiled. Over dinner at the diner attached to the motor court, Roy laid the map on the table and they looked at it together. Skip Marchetti in Santa Fe. The Vega brothers in Needles, they'd have to backtrack slightly, come back through Albuquerque, but the route was planned to accommodate it. Denny Castillo in Amarillo. And then the final circle, Albuquerque. Garrett traced his finger along the route. He stopped at one of the circles and looked up at Roy. You talked to Denny? Friday. Garrett was quiet. Denny Castillo had been closer to Garrett than to most of the others. They'd grown up in neighboring towns in the California Central Valley, had both ended up in Arizona by different roads, had found the Brotherhood at roughly the same time. When the brotherhood fractured, Denny and Garrett had stayed in touch longer than most, but eventually the distance had won, and the silence had come for them too. "He doing all right?" Garrett said. "He picked up on the second ring," Roy said. "Make of that what you want." Garrett nodded slowly. He folded his hands around his coffee cup. "I owe you an apology," he said. He was looking at the map when he said it, not at Roy. "The things I said after. About what happened. I had nowhere to put it." Roy was quiet. Garrett looked up. "I know that's not enough." "It's a start," Roy said. And it was. Santa Fe was 40 miles north of I-40 up Route 285, and Roy and Pete and Garrett came in off the highway mid-morning the next day, the city materializing out of the high desert with its low brown buildings and its huge uninterrupted sky. Skip Marchetti had moved here in the winter of 2001, after his wife's things were sorted and the house in Barstow had been sold, because his daughter lived here and had an extra room, and Skip was at the age where he'd decided that proximity to family was worth more than the particular texture of any one place. Roy had Skip's address from Pete's map. They found the house in a quiet neighborhood near the Acequia Madre, an old irrigation ditch that ran through the south part of the city with cottonwood trees along it that had turned gold in the October cold, the leaves trembling and bright. Roy parked Eleanor on the street in front of the house and looked at the building, a small adobe, a painted blue door, a yucca plant in the front yard that had been there long enough to be the height of a man. He knocked. Skip Marchetti opened the door and looked at Roy Decker, and the color came into his face and then went out of it and then came back, all in the space of 3 seconds. Skip was 70 years old that autumn. The oldest of them by almost a decade. He'd ridden through Korea in his mind, though his body had been stateside. His brother had died at Incheon in 1950, and Skip had joined the Brotherhood because he understood, without having served himself, what the men who had served were carrying. He had a face that was all vertical lines, the deep creases of a man who had spent decades in the desert sun, and eyes that were very blue and very still. He looked past Roy to the street, where Pete and Garrett stood next to the 3 bikes. Skip's hand came up and touched the doorframe, and he did not say anything for a long moment. He was looking at the Super Glide. Roy said, "Pete rebuilt her." Skip looked at the Super Glide for a long time. The sun was behind the cottonwoods and the gold leaves moved in the cold air, and the light was the particular heavy quality of autumn in the high desert, where the sky and the earth seemed to be considering each other seriously. Skip said, "How long you stopping?" Roy said, "One night. We're going to Amarillo tomorrow." Skip nodded slowly. He said, "Give me 20 minutes." He closed the door. Roy stood on the step. Behind him, Pete and Garrett waited with the bikes. The 20 minutes Skip took were for these things. He called his daughter to say he'd be gone for a few days. He found his cut, the Iron Promise leather, in the back of the closet under a box of his wife's winter things that he had never been able to put away. He put the cut on. He checked the pockets and found, in the inside left pocket, a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a note in his wife's handwriting, written God knew when. "You belong out on that road, sweetheart. Don't let me keep you from it." He read it twice. He put it back. He came out through the blue door carrying a helmet and with the Iron Promise patch visible on his back, and Roy stood up from the step where he'd been sitting, and that was the moment, that exact moment of Skip coming through the blue door with his cut on, that something in Roy Decker's chest completed itself, not the resolution, not yet, but the sense of the shape of what was coming. 4 bikes now. 4 men. East from Santa Fe on I-25 toward the turn for Amarillo. This is the part of the road that most people don't know. Between Santa Fe and Tucumcari, New Mexico, the land flattens and the sky grows in direct proportion to how flat the land becomes, until you are riding through a space that is primarily sky, the earth reduced to a strip of brown at the bottom of an enormous blue dome. In the late afternoon, the clouds come up from the west. In October they are long and low and purple-gray, and they move with a slow authority that makes a man feel that the weather here is doing something permanent rather than merely passing through. Roy rode at the front. Behind him, Pete on Eleanor. Behind Pete, Garrett on the red Sportster. Behind Garrett, Skip on his own machine, his 1978 Harley-Davidson low rider, which he had kept in a storage unit in Santa Fe the way you keep a thing you can't bear to sell even when you've decided to stop using it. The storage unit key had been in his jacket pocket the whole time, Roy understood. Some part of Skip had never stopped waiting. They came into Tucumcari at dusk and ate at a Mexican restaurant on Route 66, the four of them around a table with chips and salsa and red chili that took the cold out of Roy's hands by the second bowl. The conversation was sparse but not strained. They talked about the road. They talked about the bikes. Garrett said the Sportster's clutch was pulling a little heavy and Pete said he could look at it in the morning and Garrett said he'd appreciate that. Skip ate methodically and said almost nothing and occasionally looked at the window where their 4 motorcycles were parked in the yellow light of the restaurant, and the look on his face was the look of a man reclaiming something he had incorrectly believed was gone for good. Roy looked at the photograph again over his coffee. He put it on the table face up. Nobody commented on it being there. It sat in the middle of the table with the chips and the salsa and the coffee cups, Calhoun in the center of the frame, 8 men on a desert road, the sky the color of a gas flame. The next morning they crossed into Texas on Route 66 and the world changed again, the high desert suddenly giving way to the staked plain, the Llano Estacado, that vast and unadorned horizontal space that is one of the most genuinely strange landscapes in North America. Flat. Absolutely flat, in a way that even the Mojave is not, because at least the Mojave has its distances and its shimmering heat distortion. The Llano Estacado is just flat, and then more flat, and then the sky, and then the question of what it means to be a small thing moving across an enormous surface. Amarillo appeared on the horizon as a low smear of buildings and grain elevators against the sky, and Roy felt a tightening in his chest as the city grew that was not dread, exactly, but close to it. Because Denny Castillo was 29 years old and Roy had known him since he was a boy. Denny's father, Victor Castillo, had been in the Brotherhood in the old days, one of the original members, one of the men who had ridden with Calhoun in the early years, the years before Roy joined. Victor had died in 1993 of a heart attack in his kitchen in Needles, and Calhoun had ridden Denny to the funeral on the back of the Super Glide, Denny's hands gripping Calhoun's sides the whole way, Denny who had been 21 years old and without a father. The Brotherhood had been Denny's family. And Roy had let it dissolve. He had known that for 14 months. He had not let himself look at it directly. But here on the flat Texas plain with Amarillo growing on the horizon and Denny waiting somewhere in it, there was no more angle to look from. The knowledge came straight at him in the morning light, and Roy Decker let it land. He pulled off onto the shoulder and stopped the bike and put his feet down. Behind him, Pete stopped, then Garrett, then Skip. They idled for a moment and then Pete killed.